it's not just beer, it's people, it's artists, it's a community.
All right. Thanks for tuning in to The Makers by Crafted Media. My name is Craig. I am the producer of Crafted.
And my name is Bobby Bowen. I am the owner and head brewer of Bo Wiegand's Beer Company, and I guess co-host of The Makers podcast here.
Cool. Yeah, my name is Sebastian Wolfrum. I am the owner and executive maltster of Epiphany Craft Malt up in Durham, North Carolina.
Awesome. So I think we'll dive in. Maybe we'll talk about how we all kind of roundabout know each other. So I produced a show called Crafted. We went up to Charlotte, North Carolina for our third season, which just came out. And Epiphany Malt was nice enough to take part in the series. Sebastian was actually on the series, and we used some of their malt for the collaborative beer, which I have here.
Nice.
And which is also out now. You can order it online from bavana.com. And then I think, Bobby, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you kind of know Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, you were just talking about that. I don't think we've officially met, but yeah. Nice to meet you here.
Absolutely.
I think I was telling Craig the first time I started using your malt was when he came out to film the first season of Crafted. I think it was kind of in the pre-prep of that, and we were doing a new beer at that time, and I can't remember how I came across it, but I came across your company, saw the malt, got excited about it, ordered a bunch, and that beer became one of our flagships within, I think, 3 weeks, and
That's awesome.
So we've been using it ever since.
That's great. Oh, it's great to hear. Yeah, we are located in North Carolina, and I always say that you can't go much further south and still successfully make malt. It gets too warm for the grain mainly, right? Process-wise, you can obviously do it, but just from a growing perspective. And so we're probably the closest in many ways to being local for Florida as it can be in some ways. Yeah, and so we're distributed through Country Malt, the Country Malt Group. So it's possible that was one of the many avenues that you got a hold of us, which is great, right? It just helps move things around, and everybody gets a little bit of this stuff that we do. And I'm glad to hear that you're having such a success and people really respond well.
Yeah, and like you said, I think North Carolina has become the de facto local malt
supplier
for Florida.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if real quick, if you can give, because I think we're kind of working backwards at this, but some of the listeners who might not know the whole, like the exact malting process and what that means, if you can give a quick breakdown of that process. Yeah.
So as I mentioned earlier, I didn't really get into it, but there's three main steps for malting specifically. So that first step is what I call steeping, where we essentially have a big tank that often, really looks like a fermenter. It's got a cone at the base and a cylinder on the top, and you soak your grain for 4 to 6 hours. It's probably the shortest of all of the steps, and the grain is really so thirsty, and it wants to kind of bring the moisture up to in the end 40, 42, 44%. That's sort of the perfect moisture level. And so during those first 4 to 6 hours, you get to 30, 32%. You drain that steep. You do like what's called a dry rest. And then you soak it again to get to the next temperature level. And then that process step ends. So it's really within 24 hours or so. You get to the full moisture, and the 40, 42% is only such a specific number because that's how much water it takes that the whole kernel is wet, right? The entire inside, and that's key for malting. And so at that point, the kernel really wakes up and gets going, and that's when germination starts, right? It starts sprouting, and it gets transferred into, if you have a traditional setup, you go on a floor, right? In a modern setting, you go into a germination vessel. We have a square box. Some people have a round vessel. Some people have drums. But in there, you essentially controlling temperature and moisture, and you let the grain start growing, and that goes in most cases, as I said, 5, 6, 7 days. And during that initial growth step, that initial germination, you see a rootlet come out, but you don't really see the actual leaflet or stalk what the grass is above the ground, right? You don't get to that level in those first 5, 6 days. But what you get to is that what most of the kernel is essentially an energy storage, and it's starch. And that's really there for the plant when it gets wet, right, out in the world, it rains on it. That's the energy it will take in order to develop enough of that rootlet and get the stem out to get sunlight and nutrients, right? And so the maltster, so folks have figured this out. So the maltster makes use of this. You get it to fully activate this energy storage pocket, right? The starch kernel. And then we dry it down, right? You basically wait the 5, 6, 7 days to get to the maximum. In the language, it's called modification, right? The whole kernel gets modified into sugars and proteins mainly. And then you switch from cold and humid, right, temperature control to hot and dry. You do the third last step, which is kilning, and that really is 3 phases. Initially, it's free drying. So initially, moisture comes off easy. It's like having clothes on a clothes hanger. But then a couple hours in, you kind of need to raise the temperature in order to force the water out. At some point, the grain doesn't really want to give up. Under 10% moisture, basically doesn't want to give up that last bit of water. And that's how we really got to kilning, how we understand it and these flavor and color profiles, because folks figured out you need to really, in order to get it dry so you can store it for a while, you need to apply heat to kind of sweat it out, really is sort of, simplest way to understand it. And during that last step of this drying out, we've gotten with the technology and using blowers and all this to a place where you can go really, really high without lighting it on fire to create really nice flavors once it's really dried down and color. And and those 3 steps are malting steps. And then you clean it and you bag it and off it goes to a brewer. But so steeping, germinating, and kilning, drying is the 3 processes.
It's fascinating to talk about and hear another process that's such involved in something that we do day to day as craft brewers. Like I say, next time I'm up there, I'll give you a shout, and I'd love to come see the process and see the actual malting and stuff happening.
Yeah.
Because it's something you're involved in it so much, but still such a.
It seems far away for you, right?
So far away still. Yeah.
Sure. Oh.
Sebastian, why don't you tell us a little bit about Epiphany Malt and what it is you guys are up to there?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, as many and most probably of those who are watching and listening know, right, malt is the key ingredient to making beer. So it's historically, 10,000 years ago, somebody by accident malted grain, and then that turned into some crazy fermented beverage, which we now have turned into beer, really, but it was probably far from it. And so that's still true today, that without germinating and transforming primarily barley, but wheat and rye and other things that are malted, you can't really brew with it, right? It needs to be functional and then also have a pleasant malt flavor. And so what we do is, at Epiphany specifically, we started 7 years ago and have a handful of farmers, mostly in North Carolina, a little bit in Virginia, some in Tennessee, so a little network for various reasons. And and they grow for us. It's a winter crop in the south, right? It's too hot over the summer, and so it grows over the winter. And then we get it in, and we follow a simple 3-step process that seems easier than brewing beer, but it's got its tricks. It only uses 2 ingredients, so the grain and then water. And the grain needs to be of specific qualities, otherwise it doesn't work, right? The process seems simple, but it needs to germinate and have the right proteins and develop an enzyme package and all these things during germination, and that's the functional part. And you can mill it once we're done, and so when we dry it down, basically we remove all the moisture, germination stops, and you have functional flavorful malt. And so without that, you couldn't mill it, right? It would be hard as rocks. Without the step, it would often taste more like some kind of grassy beverage in some ways, right? If it's not dried properly. And so yeah, a lot of how we experience beer today has to do with sort of what has come of the process and what we do here at Epiphany.
And you get all of your malt from local farmers up in North Carolina?
Yeah, so it grows right around us. Mostly barley, right? It's good 80% of what we touch is barley. And then, as I said, we do wheat, we do rye, we do corn, spelt, buckwheat, rice, and all kinds of fun stuff. So anything that's a small grain, we try and sprout.
Yeah. Cool. I got a lot of questions that I want to get to, but I'll start since we're on this topic here. Like, how do you? So you said you've been going at it about 7 years.
Yeah.
Like, how did you go about choosing which farmers you want to work with, where you want to get the grain from, and source that? Like, what was your thought process behind that?
When we take grain in, as I mentioned earlier, the specifics are really the quality. And it relates to, size, so that's plumpness, protein levels, but then also that the grain is not, has weathered in any form, right? That it could be damaged of sorts and no longer sprouting. There could be little spores or fungi on it. So all these things we can't have. And so you need a farmer that pays attention to the winter crop and is kind of good on managing, the weather and when they need to address some of these, pests or pressures, right, that come up. And so it's almost like a self-selecting process, but initially we only bought from seed growers. But the folks already specialize in growing small grains for seed, for around here, and often they grow down here to sell up north, out west for cover crops. And so those folks really know how to manage the crop so it's pure, right? There's no other seed in it, and it germinates, because that's the whole point of seed, right? That it grows again. And then from there, we kind of developed a little protocol of how we onboard farmers at this point. But the farmers know if they can do it or not. And so plenty of people say, that's not for me, or I'm good, right? So it's self-selecting, really.
I think, one thing we covered a lot in season 3 when I was interviewing you, Sebastian, was how malt affects flavor. And chasing flavor, I think, was even a whole episode that we dedicated to that. Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about that? And I think, Bobby, you could probably chime in with this as well, how malt affects flavor of beer. I think people maybe don't realize that it affects it as much as it probably does.
Yeah, I'll let Sebastian take this one.
Well, let me jump right in. So I would say probably at least the last 10 years or so, as more and more books came out about also fermentation and the whole industry. Bobby, you certainly know that there's a lot more variety of yeast out there, right? There's all these. I mean, the selection is really, really cool and mind blowing, right? From Kveik yeast now from Norway, which is a completely new thing, to all kinds of altered varieties of yeast, right? Strains that now make terpenes, right? Hop flavors,
Styles
so
and yeah, all kinds of different stuff. I wish some of it would have existed when we opened, especially like the Kvike strain. I'm like, where was? I'm
right.
sure. I mean, it existed, but I didn't know about it.
It's an amazing stuff that now has come out, and so looping back to this flavor component, right? So the main thing that people think about, at least in the industry, is that 80% or so of the flavors are derived from the fermentation, right? So that's basically all the yeast activity, and in many ways that's true, right? Hops and malt contribute seemingly very little, but then I get to it what we do specifically, but overall, just to sum this up, the fermentation and the way it runs, right? There's a lot that the brewer is always in control of, and that starts with making the wort, right, and how you mash and prepare, and what kind of enzyme activity you get, and how you break things down, and all these building blocks that essentially are created from the raw malt, us malting it, the brewer milling it, mashing, and how it's done, creates this sort of toolbox, let's call it, for the yeast strains. And depending on what their functional preferences are, you get these amazing flavors plus alcohol plus carbonation, right? So a lot of the drivers that make beer what it is come from yeast fermentation. That said, we have, as a maltster, a lot of control over these initial building blocks, right? And hops have sort of two functions. They create this sort of base bitterness, and then these various aromas that we all know disappear quickly, right? If the beer is a good IPA, after 8 weeks, it's really tough to still have a complex bouquet, because these oils and volatile compounds kind of go away. And so the malt is sort of the backbone and the balance, but also essentially for all these phenolic flavors that yeast creates, sort of the nutrient. and the alcohol fermentation, right? What people associate with these two main features of beer, right? The carbonation and the alcohol. That has directly to do with the brewer really doing the math right on how much sugar you get in, right? And then hitting the target in the brew house. But depending on if you make a pale ale with, 10 units of sugar or 12 units of sugar, it's going to be a very different pale ale, because the whole fermentation and alcohol level, all this is different. And so in many ways, right, depending on how you look at it, that also is sort of driven by the malt and the malt character. And then specifically what we see here, malting here in the Southeast, the winter grains that we use have a lot more of minerally savory character. I mean, it's still malt, right? It still has sweetness, and depending on how it gets dried, we get sort of a nice sort of sweet toast characters into it in many ways. But the sort of these summer barleys that most people work with that are coming from the Midwest or into Canada or mostly from Europe, those are all they're missing this sort of more savory mineral character, and it's really mostly sweet and has sort of these bread or butter cookie biscuity notes. It's there's a little bit of a dimension missing, and now it's coming specifically to us, right? Any maltster is doing something of what we're doing, but working with the small guy is very similar to going to a local brewery in many ways, right? We only ship to so many breweries. We know most of our customers, and we deal with everybody if they want to directly. And so when people order, nothing's ever older than 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks sometimes. So because it's enough movement, and we are flexible with our equipment sizes and all that. And so it becomes a lot like fresh coffee, right? Where coffee that's roasted and you drink it within 2 to 3 weeks has a lot more finesse and aromas. And this is the same is true with us. So a lot of the complexities and the freshness of it is something that for craft brewers works really well. that's something that you can get. And so there's a whole side to it that craft malt often brings because of the size of the businesses and the nimbleness, and the malt that comes from further away often is stored for months and months at a time. And so you could be mean and say it's bland, but that's not really what this is about, right? It's really, it will allow you to make a lot more consistent beer if you bring, who should I use as an example? Like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, you don't want fine nuances all the time shining through that, right? Obviously, you want to make the same beer all year, every year, and they do a great job at it. And for them, it's great that the malt has 6 months on it.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you touched on it. Like, malt is the backbone and the building blocks of beer, but it could be so much more, and it could add all these nuances and intricacies. You look at drinking a lager pale ale versus an imperial stout or something like that, that's going to have lots more malt character and flavors, and you're using different styles of malts, layered on top of each other. It really, there's so much you can do with it, and it's a big reason too. I think I love this time of year, like Oktoberfest, and getting back to doing a lot more like German style beers and lagers and stuff, because to me that's where malt can really shine in different beers, because it's lager, it's more of a clean fermentation, not a whole lot of yeast presence and esters, but you get those little subtle nuances, and when we do our Oktoberfest, we can tweak things here and there and try like a little bit this special malt or this one built up on top of each other, and you can, I know, like versus like an IPA where there's tons of hops thrown into it and it's going to be a little bit more difficult to pick out. So like these style of beers, when you can really get into the finesse of the malt, is, like I said, it's one of my favorite times of year. So I'm usually pretty happy around this time. I was kind of just doing a little bit of research, and something we do like to do with this podcast, and what I like to try to learn a little bit is people's backstory, and where they came from and how they got into what they're doing. If you don't know, if we can touch on that a little bit, because I know, Sebastian, if I know you were born in Germany. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I grew up. Yeah, totally, absolutely. Yeah, no,
Okay. If you can just tell me, like, kind of a little bit of your backstory and how you got to where you are, what got you into craft beer, what you got into craft malting. I'll kind of let you start from the relative beginning.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I grew up outside of Munich, a small town within reach of the big city, from my perspective, certainly growing up, and out of high school, essentially, went for the hands-on apprenticeships sort of track that exists, right? So you can learn any kind of major craft or other types of jobs, really, through a mix of on-the-job training and professional schooling, and so that's how I ended up in the industry. So 2 towns over where I grew up is the Eyinger Brewery, which people know around in the US because of their success on getting into the beer shelves early and plenty of places. So that certainly helped me when I came over to kind of say where I were, and lots of people who care about beer knew and know the brewery. And so for me, it was really just the next one. I mean, I literally grew up, 5 miles from there. And so,
one of my favorites too. And I was when I saw that, I'm like, I got to ask him about it, because I still, like, hands down, one of the best, like, Hefeweizens I've had. They're well known for a lot of things, but it's an amazing,
and it's a small brewery even for Bavarian or German standards, right? It's really just a regional brewer, and yeah, so I did a full cycle of that. You go to school in Munich, and then you go to, like, we had our final exam out in Weinstefan, but it can move around. And essentially, the brewmasters take the exam, so they collaborate with the trade school that everybody has to go to, but you get paid, which is kind of nice. So you basically get trained on the job, and for me and for most everybody else, you in those 2 years you move through all the different departments twice. So in your first year, and then you do the same thing your second year, and I got exposed to some malting. They don't malt at Ainger anymore, but I got exposed to that as well. And so I certainly came away with a full-on understanding of how everything is done, and luckily with Ainger at a really high and skillful level. So that was pretty amazing. And so I stayed on for a couple of years, and then moved to the US. I met my wife. That's how I ended up here. So I immediately was intrigued by, this was 2005 and 6, by the craft beer movement. But looking at it today, it just seemed like there was nothing there. I mean, we had 20 breweries in North Carolina, right? I mean, it was like, and now it's 400. I mean, it's like you can't even compare. But like from my perspective, I already felt like there's a lot going on, right? So, and people were allowed to do anything, right? Over here, obviously, it's totally normal to make a Belgian beer, German, American, sour, not sour, whatever. And it wasn't as crazy in 2005, but it was still the same spirit. Like you couldn't make, in Germany, you would never make an English bitter. It's just not how it works. Right? It's maybe a little bit more that there's some craft breweries, but in general, I mean, you can go to many places and you won't get one unless to go to Irish pub or something. And so it was really intriguing, and the total opposite, right? At Ainger, they've made the same beer roughly, right? With obviously some industrial, technical and sort of improvements, but overall for the last 120, 150 years or so, right? Wow. And so each brewmaster tweaks maybe a little bit, and there was just equipment upgrades and whatnot. But overall, that's true. And so, like you're locked into, and always in a very good way, into doing this thing over and over. And if something was wrong, I witnessed this when this happened. If something is really wrong, like the mayor shows up, right? And that's how much you're sort of tied into the community. It's a matter for the highest office, right? If something is up. And important. And totally, it's important. And so so that was, and it's like the total opposite, right? I mean, here's obviously like it's a full exploration of everything, and we all have learned a lot in the last 10 years alone of all these limits that mostly craft beer has been pushing up against, right? From all these hop creep discoveries to all these yeast strains. All of a sudden, I mean, there's been really, really cool developments that would not have happened if everybody would have stuck with their traditional approaches. And so then anyway, I got here, right? Started as a brewmaster at Natty Greens in Greensboro, which at the time was, I don't know, brewery number, who knows, 23 or 24. They opened 2004. And then by the time everything really got going, I would say 2008 and 9, I got involved helping open or start the Brewers Guild here in the state. And that really got me sort of connected with the entire community. And you guys know how important these groups are, right? To really kind of bundle the energy. And
that's great. That's awesome. I was reading that too, because it's to be involved from the ground floor is really cool. Coming over and help starting that. And now, like North Carolina is, one of the hubs on the on the East Coast for brewing. Yeah. There's just so much going on there. And like you said, coming over from, early 2005, 2006 until now, it's completely different, but at the same time too, like we were looking at it, I was looking at the same thing. Like once you first get into that craft beer and you see it, it just kind of blows your mind. Like there's so much possibilities and there's so much going on, but it was much smaller network back then. And then it's grown to, and from my eyes, it's just a much larger network, and just so much going on with it. So that's cool that you're able to be in and get from that ground floor up and kind of in that state, that movement.
Yeah, no, it was, and it really allowed me to kind of build a little of a perspective, and then really out of that experience and the connections, right, and sort of seeing more of what the landscape is like and what's going on, I basically, so there, I mean, let's get to then craft malt, right? So I started looking around, should I do something myself? And at the time, this was 2012, 13, we already were at 150 or so, probably 180 breweries. And I was like, wow, how many more are there possible, to add another? And should I do one, right? Like, what should I really be looking at? And so by then, there were already a handful of craft maltsters who had started up around North America, really, one or two in Canada, up in New York and Massachusetts and up there a little bit, one out west and certainly here in North Carolina and Virginia, there were one each. And so that's where the Epiphany came from. I was at a meeting with brewers here in the state and organized by NC State, and they said, hey, what can we do to get more local ingredients into the beers? And as you can imagine, right, everybody was saying, well, we can grow grain, we want to brew with it, but somebody's got to malt it, right? There's this sort of odd bottleneck. And because the craft malt scene was still very, very young, and there was no equipment and also then really no training, right? This is a totally new thing, and there isn't a school for this either, right? It's a very, very up until craft malt got into where we are now, where there is at least one in almost every state, and it was a very highly concentrated, big industrial set of companies that were doing this. This is definitely true in Europe as well. This kind of really got scaled and scaled and scaled. And so it was only a handful of people doing it for thousands of brewers in some sense, right? And so there was a lack of knowledge, skills, and then also equipment in many ways, right? And that was part of this inspiration and how this sort of Epiphany as a business came about, that I knew that there was interest. I knew that this was needed. I knew that not everybody was excited about what was currently available. And so I was like, okay, I went to school for this. I have connections. Let me figure this out. And so it's 2013, I really got going. Took me a good 2 years to find money, find equipment, get all it lined up. And so by 2015, we were started building the malting operation. And so we've been in operation ever since. And so that's been really fun. And it really sort of fits into, I guess, who I am in the industry. I am admittingly, I like making beer, and brewing is really a cool process. And I love thinking and working and helping, certainly with all sorts of customers and I teach a little bit about brewing. So all that is part of that. But I kept being outmatched by many of my peers while I was still on the brewing side of making ever hoppier beers and all these. I was already ripe for more malt forward stuff. And so I was like, okay, maybe I should worry about the malting, right? And that's how I ended up doing it once I saw that I can get equipment and it kind of all can work out. And so that's how we came about. And I really then belong into a sort of a second cohort. And from what I can tell, we are still one of the only ones where there's a brewer started malt house, right? Most of it is either from people who start new into it, and the early ones, often they were like, hey, we want to make really beer, right? We want to be a craft brewery, but we want it to be local. And then often people said, okay, I'll just start making malt first and we'll see if I get into brewing, that kind of stuff. There's from these early maltsters, there's lots of stories like that. And so then folks like me who sort of came in, so I think from a brewer's perspective, I'm sort of the unique in many ways. And then we had a whole wave, and that's still kind of going, of either cooperatives or direct farmers starting malt houses, right? Once this is sort of caught on that you can kind of make quality malt at a smaller scale, and there's now more and more equipment available, there seemed to be a natural tendency because of, the process and growing grain and storing grain, and then the malting is sort of the next step, especially in larger farming settings where there's multiple family members. Often somebody in the family takes on the malting piece as sort of a side value-added business. And so that's sort of the latest main push that I see in the industry as it sort of matures on the small malting end. So
that's cool, and it's a smart move too. Like when you see a budding industry and things kind of growing and skyrocketing, like the craft beer movement is, find a way to service that industry and get a way to supply all of those companies versus competing and starting one. Like I think we initially had a conversation. We opened up in 2015 as well, and like around that time too, we had talked about like, oh, do we look at like malting equipment and getting into that? And I'm like, that's a whole nother field. Sure. I don't know about it. No, I went the beer route. But no, it's a smart move. It's awesome. And it's cool that you can take that passion and everything you know about making beer and put that into the malt, because you're not just, like you said, making one thing constantly. You have a wider range of different malts and varieties and stuff that you do. And you can, come out with a new variety if you want. You can come out with a new line of malt and different styles just by tweaking something. And I think, like I said, if you're anything like me, it's just, it's that passion that you can put forth and always, keep innovating, keep trying new stuff. I was reading a little bit too. I know you say you don't do any floor malting. You like to really fully control the process, through, from the start to finish. And if you want to talk a little bit about that,
sure.
Your equipment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good topic as well. So it comes often across as a little bit, I don't know, arrogant or sort of minimizing what floor malting is or whatever. And that's really not the case. I do think that part of the success of Epiphany was that we came to it from an angle of, as I said, sort of knowledge and training and equipment and sort of science driven, like a lot of analyzing, working together with there's a lab up in New York that most people are using that just does grain and malt analysis that was started as New York State has sort of a unique role. They had a whole craft malt set of bills to support malt and brewing together, and so that's how this came about up there. And so we've been using all this data, and then the equipment that we have allows to control all the variables. I mentioned earlier, right? There's only water and grain as the two ingredients, and then the rest is you running the process from aerating and steeping, how that's done, right? That's initially just getting the grain wet, to then controlling temperature and humidity, and fresh air against reuse air. So an air mix, you can use all these tools to kind of speed up, slow down, bring it together, drive it apart, to use a few words without getting into too much details here. While you have 4, 5, 6 days of germination, and that really kind of changes the entire outcome of what kind of malt you're making once you turn the kiln on, because all these are just preparations for the flavor components. That is then what everybody experiences as malt, right? Initially, these first, as I said, 6, 7 days with steeping and germination is really just the functional pieces. But the drying is where we make color and flavor, which is what most people really are focused on, and that's obviously very important. But whatever you do in those days leading up to drying it down is really critical to making either a Pilsner or a Vienna or a Munich malt, right? I mean, there's and that's all these decisions between low and high moisture, warmer, colder germination, more fresh air, less fresh air, all these things, and since we're able to control all this, I think we really I think in a good way, we're able to prove that even in a sort of challenged region, right, where barley is not traditionally grown, we sort of make off-cycle malt in many ways, right? It's not what everybody else is sort of using in terms of winter barley and all that. And so it was good for us to sort of be a proof for many, many of the craft brewers in the region that you can actually, that your local can also be good and have quality and meet expectations of the brewers. And I think we, in a good way, we sort of helped kind of raise the bar a little bit and kind of change that perception. And that was necessary. And that part of it was the equipment and the choice. And I still think, given the challenges that we have here, it is a really important tool. And so with floor malting, to get to that, right? That's how for thousands of years, basically, people have been making malt. It's always was, you get it wet and you lay it out on the floor, probably traditionally on some kind of clay or rooftops, right? In the Middle East, where all this initially came from, that's probably how all this was made in order to dry down. And then later on, there were fires were made and some kind of stoking thing, and so it was very crude. But it was always that kind of process, because that's the most basic, and naturally, that's how many of the small maltsters got going and still get going, because you don't need to take on this huge capital outlay and start at a very sizable beginning. If you get equipment, you start pretty big. There's not a whole lot of, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do small scale. So you end up on the floor, and the floor malt is not inferior in many ways. It's really different, right? So it's like you all can imagine, right? You just have this carpet of grain. It's often this deep. So I'm showing, 8 to 10, 12 inches maybe. And it gets flipped over a couple times a day with rakes, right? And that's gets in fresh air, unroots them, cools them down, right? And so we do all this in our process through forced air and turners and so you have a lot more control over that. And with this hand process that this has been done for thousands of years, it's not that simple. And so when you look at it, both from a heat perspective and also from a fresh air versus CO2 kind of perspective, you would look down through some lenses and it would look like a shaggy carpet, right? There's hot spots, colder spots. The hot spots have more CO2. The other ones have more oxygen. And so these different sort of microclimates that are happening in the malting floor lead to faster and slower and differently germinating grains. And it makes, in many, many ways, it makes a lot of different flavor components that you don't get from modern, much more controlled process malts. But it's really hard to then make any variety, right? They all end up Maris Otter type, right? They often have higher color, more aroma, more flavor, because that's just how the process kind of drives it. If you want to make good malt with it, and that's sort of the main difference between those two. And I think the commercial brewers talk about this, right? That Maris Otter has forever, and still seems to be a preference if you want to really make really malt forward flavorful beers, right? And if you just use Pilsner from Canada, it's just beer, right?
Yeah, it's going to be lacking a little bit in that. And sometimes that's what you want versus the depth of a little bit more character, breadiness, nuttiness, stuff like that. But
it really comes from those two different processes, right? This modern malting versus floor malting. You couldn't make a Pilsner malt with floor malting. It's really realistically not possible because of that uneven germination characteristic.
I think you're a lot like me, and I hate inconsistencies in brewing, and like you're testing different things. You need like consistent each time, and like the same thing I think with the floor malting versus an old world style or traditional style versus new school, where you can really fine tune and dial in exactly what you want to do. And I think there's room for room for both, but like if you're like me, and I think a guy like you that wants to have consistencies and full control over the whole process. So it's really cool to hear that from your perspective. Because, from my perspective as a brewer, you hear for malted, you're just going to think more of traditional style processes, not necessarily like, okay, I hadn't thought about, you don't really see for malted Pilsner malts, you see Maris Otter. So that all clicks.
Coming together as makers, as we call the show, how Sebastian, can you, as a small maltster, and Bobby, you as a, small independent brewery, work with each other, maybe on a more intimate level, than you could with ordering from one of the bigger malt companies, to really like maybe Bobby express what you're looking for and Sebastian be able to give him what he's looking for.
When folks come through and see the malt house, the first thing we always point out is that if you come into Epiphany, it's the same as walking into any local brewery. You come in, there's a handful of people. So with us, you walk in, right? There's nobody's really stopping you. Just come in and you're right in there. Like it's in one space, and you can see all the equipment. Some is in the distance, some is right up front, but there's no warehouses and industrial size spaces in any way, right? It's just us and what we do pretty much in the same space. And that's really, I think, what sort of drives the communication, and then essentially how you can work with all these small brewers that we work with, that you can, like, our size is not at any scale where we can't pay attention to any one request, and especially for the roasted stuff, right? If we, let's say we make a batch of chocolate malt, right, which is roasted, finished malt, roasted for about 90 minutes or so in a roaster, similar to a coffee roaster, and you kind of drive in a lot of color and aroma. And so Bobby could come and say, hey, last time your chocolate was a little too dark for us. It was not complex on flavor. So we only make 6, 7, 8 bags at a time. It's a very, very reasonable amount. And so there's no production issues to then adjust something. And so we do this all the time. People buy a couple bags, where we make smoke malt all the time too. And it's always to order. And then somebody only wants 3 or 4 bags, and we have a couple left over, and those then get sold off to somebody who's just asking. But in this case, again, people often ask for specific wood and how intense they want it. And so that's, I think, without anybody really asking for something, that sort of throws a big wrench into the system. It's really not, right? And it's that really makes a difference, right? On any of the big commercial maltsters, you don't even know who to call, right?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Like you said, I couldn't call up one of our, like, a large supplier maltster and be like, hey, your 2-row, I wasn't crazy about it. Let's toast it just a little bit longer. Then no. Yeah.
And so that's really I think the key, and that's sort of, I mean, that's all we do. We know that's, we don't compete on price or volume, anything. It's just not, and it's the same for the craft brewers, right? You're never going to come out with a $5.99 6-pack because you want to chase down course. I mean, there's no point.
It's not possible.
Right. And why would you, right? And so, and this is the same with us on that same, with the same logic. And that's, I think there's this natural collaboration that then happens. And from my experience, if people kind of think about, even the folks who don't go to breweries all the time, think about how, the restaurant world already functions pretty well, right? There's out of the 100 restaurants that are around you, let's say, there's maybe 10, 15 who are like farm to table style, right, where they have local farms and everything's kind of fresh and it rotates seasonally. And then there's sort of a group of 30, 40 maybe who do really well, but it's sort of a mix, and sometimes things are local, or they have a local meat supplier or whatever, they use local beer, and but some of it is obviously comes from some distributor. And then there's the other half, which is just they just make food and they focus on the food, and it comes from who knows where, and that's not part of their focus. And this is very much true with breweries as well. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that our customer base is a specific subset, right? You need to pay attention to it. You need to be able to tell the story, have the brewing skills to deal with it, and make something work. And then also be excited about it, right? I mean, Bobby, he clearly pays attention to this, and then he notices there's something going on, and sure enough, people can tell too, right? This beer turned into a crowd favorite, and so that's I think the with food it's the same thing, right? If it's fresh and you kind of know and feel its origins, it's a totally different story.
Well, yeah, and then maybe pairing food with craft beer. It takes it a step further, right?
It's all, it all goes hand in hand. And I think that's the beauty of it with craft beer. The brewers, especially like, on our side of it, put so much into the beer and how much they care about the process. And like Sebastian was talking about, everywhere from mashing in and having the proper procedures to fermentation to, building your recipe. And I always talk to people too, but like there's a whole nother process, and it starts in the field with the farmers, and it goes to the maltsters. And there's so much more science and stuff behind it that a lot of people don't realize. And like he talks about, like roasting the chocolate to 90 minutes, but I'm sure there's, if he goes a couple degrees higher or 5-10 minutes here and there, it's going to completely change something, maybe for better, maybe for worse. But there's so much care and intricacies that you can do coming from the craft malting side, and that just pairs with everything, and it goes all the way down the line, Craig, like you were talking about. And then you start pairing with local restaurants and farm to table restaurants, and it's just this whole circle that can really play off each other and really meld together. That's, I think, is that story, and what excites people. I mean, excites people like me. So I hope others as well. But it helps us all share this passion. But it's not just one person doing it and one company doing it. There's a lot of people involved, the whole process to get you that final product.
Yeah. I mean, 100%.
It really does. If I can jump in here, I'd like to finish this thought off with the people. It really starts with the farmer. Like the amount of feedback that we get, because the farmers, they're often further afield, and they don't obviously go out into the more urban areas all the time, but they go for, especially when it's slower, or they do mini vacations or whatever when these guys move around. And the amount of feedback I get from them, that they over time, they obviously deal with us. We tell them who's all brewing with it. They then sometimes seek that out, right? And they then really talk about growing the barley or the wheat or whatever we buy from the specific farmers. They really talk about that crop differently than the corn or the soybeans they do over the summer, where they just end up in a big bin and they go shuttled off to who knows where, right? They never know what's happening with that. And so they really they understand that we buy this barley and it turns into beer, and some of the breweries they go to. And so it's I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's sort of it humanizes the entire chain, and everybody knows somebody, not everybody obviously, that's part of this, and it really makes for a different level of care, interest. It gets meaning, right? it's really neat. It does change how everybody in this chain is doing their part.
And like it even keeps going too. When we use local farmers, when we have spent grain, they come back and they grab that and they feed their livestock and cattle and whatever. But yeah, that goes, and then that will go back to local restaurants, and just keeps the whole circle
going. Yeah.
So I think like what we were just talking about, like all the human connections in the process of beer. And I think it was Josh from Jasper Yeast said in an episode that what most people don't realize is that, because I was asking about the collaboration that we were working on for this season. And he was like, well, what most people don't realize is that beer making is always a collaborative process. He's like, because you start with farmers and, move to the maltsters and then to the brewers and then to the end customer. So maybe not directly collaborating, but everybody's collaborating somewhere along that chain. And I just think those stories are so cool. It almost like on the fly, I'm always thinking of like ways that we could add to a season of Crafted or an episode of Crafted, or the idea behind Crafted, which is telling these kinds of stories, right? And we've been very limited in the past, for whatever reason, because we're independent, we're just trying to do the best we can for the time being. But it might be cool to like do a season where we tell the story and start in the field and move through that whole process and end at the dinner table in a restaurant somewhere with a chef. I think that would be a prime episode.
Prime event, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I like that. I like how this last season you were able to bring in like guys like Sebastian and stuff and help kind of add a layer to that story and show not just the beer being made or the brewery, but a little bit of where everything else is coming from. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I'm in it every day and it's still fascinating to me. I love watching it. I'd love to come check out the operation one time. Next time I'm up there, I'll hit you.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if you're coming through, we're not too far off of, some of the corridors driving up, depending on, 85, 95, it's all 40, that kind of is our territory here. But I mean, the collaborativeness of this is really, it's also unique to the industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah. And I think you're absolutely right by saying it's never boring, because that's really, I think if brewing is anything, right, if you pay attention and sort of know what you're doing, you learn something every day. It's unavoidable. Yeah. Like even if you have all the textbooks on your shelf like this, and that's part of the, I guess what keeps us all really engaged as folks in the industry. And then I was just talking about this to somebody, from the distilling end. We sell to a few distilleries, not a whole lot, because the tradition around here is a lot more with raw grain, right? And these sort of sour mash things. So, but anyway, within that, you think craft distillers or distilling is like brewing, right? Or at least you could get the idea. And we were talking about this element of that the brewing industry and craft beer, no doubt, but even all the way up to the biggest breweries in the world, they might have some corporate style secrets or whatever, but overall on the level of just making the product, there seemingly are no secrets, and everybody's open. Or if you go to conferences or just go to your neighboring brewery or whatever, right, you can ask nearly anything and you get a reasonable, if not a good answer, right? And that's really unique to craft beer. I assume that's true also with restaurants a lot. And the thing that we share in that field is you can't just because I know the whatever the 90-minute IPA recipe. It's not I can just make the 90-minute IPA that Dogfish puts into a bottle. Right? There's so many more pieces to it, as we just have laid out a little bit on where you source your stuff from, how you run it, what kind of equipment you have. I mean, all these things come together. And so the brewing and the way we all do it naturally lends itself to this collaborative effort, because there is no, you really don't have to worry about your neighbor most cases, right?
Yeah, it's always been, even since we opened up, it's just been, I could call another brewery, hey, I'm out of this or need that, or hey, we're looking at this new equipment, like, have you ever used it? What do you think? And we get the same thing in return, and it's awesome because we're all trying to help each other out. We're not we're not in competition with each other. We're trying to grow this community down here. And I mean, that's the same way across the country, across the world with the craft brewers. I think everybody's so excited about what they do and have such a passion, so they're eager to share it. And when there's new research that comes out and there's new beer styles and people are talking about them, and versus just like, I have this new beer, I'm not telling anybody how I do it, because like you said, I could give out a recipe of a beer and still you wouldn't be able to hit it unless you brew it the exact same way we're brewing it. You're brewing it in the same area, the same water, same everything that goes into it, especially on our scale, because things vary a whole lot batch to batch on different ingredients we have coming in. So that's our job to make sure that those things stay consistent. But like I said, the cool part is just the constant collaboration with everybody. And I'll go every week, I'll get calls or texts from different brewers, and we all talk about different things, new stuff we're doing, or just questions about what'd you do here or how'd you do that and stuff. And it's cool to have that camaraderie, and you feel like you're not alone in this. We're all business owners in ourselves. We all have our own businesses that we're running, but you do have a network that's built in that's meant to help you out versus keeping.
So, I mean, we have a couple minutes left. Should we wrap it up for this episode?
Sure.
We can get on to our storm hunting here in Florida and let you get on with your night there, Sebastian.
Absolutely, Al.
If you guys could just give everybody give a shout to yourself, like a website, like how people can learn more about Epiphany, Bobby, of course, for Bowegans, and I'll wrap it up with Crafted.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, Epiphany, you can find us online, epiphanymalt.com. Any search will get you there. We routinely post on Instagram, and just drop us a note either through our newsletter setup or send us an email if you're interested. And certainly ask your local brewery to if they've heard about us and if they want to use some of our malts.
Cool.
And yeah, you can find us Bowegans. It's Bowigens. Just Bowegans Beer Company. You'll see on Instagram, Facebook, all the social medias and stuff. We have one thing I'll talk about real quick too. We have a competition coming up called Central Florida Top Brewer. We have 31 local breweries competing for this title of top brewer. We all draw different ingredients. You get a grain, a malt, you get a malt, a hop, two different special ingredients. So this year we did draw your percolator,
nice
coffee malt. So I just brewed with it today. Actually, it smelled amazing in the bag. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, I thought that was cool. We were able to work it out. I talked to, I forget, one of the guys up there, and they were able to get us a bag down in time so we could make it for the festival. But
fantastic.
Excited about that.
And when is that, Bobby? The date?
October 15th here in Castleberry, Florida.
Cool. And of course, my name's Craig, Makers Podcast. Thanks for tuning in tonight. You can find out more about Crafted, the series, and more about where to get this great beer that was made with Epiphany malt. All right, everyone, tune in next time for the Makers Podcast. We'll see y'all soon.